I've spent a lot of time thinking about like what is this whole modernism thing, and I don't mean that theologically, and I don't mean it in the way that literary critics mean modernism, but this thing we're talking about, and like modernism is a solvent, right? It's like an acid that is at least conceives of itself as kind of getting down to a kind of base layer. Yes, it's a solvent, right? It's a corrosive force, but it doesn't solve in the way that everybody in modernity wants to solve for X, right? That stories, as it turns out, are actually a much more helpful way of understanding and grasping and seeing than these sort of myths of subtraction.
Yeah.
And I think that novels, insofar as they participate in that subtraction, will go away. But there are certain novels that very much take up the baton of, like the epic as a kind of genre. I think of something like Moby Dick. Moby Dick is probably my favorite novel. And it's, kind of like calling it a novel is to, that doesn't really say much to call Moby Dick and, The Sun Also Rises by Hemingway. It's like, wait, those are both novels? In what world are these both novels, right? And of course, superficially, they're novels. But I think, Moby Dick participates in, the epic as a kind of sensibility. And it is trying to do something with a novel that has not been done before, exactly. And so it is more akin to the things that Shakespeare is doing with drama, or what Dante is doing with comedy, or what, Homer is doing with the epic. It's seeing itself in that kind of larger tradition. And it's almost like, you brought up Quixote earlier. What is so fascinating about Don Quixote is that he's writing it as it's already a phenomena, right? It's a critique, right, of chivalry and these kinds of things. And then in the second half, it's a commentary on the reaction that people are having to the first parts of Don Quixote, and so, if that's the birth of the novel, this is something I've actually been kind of wanting to ask you, like, at the end of the day, is modernity the same thing as post-modernity?
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah, I thank you.
Because you're right that in the two Quixote novels you have the modernity and the postmodernity. The second one is a postmodern, like ironic
Yeah.
memory of the first one and inversion and play on the slippage and memory.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
it's all there in Quixote for sure. And I think that if you look closely, I mean, the postmoderns, if you look at the postmodern theorists like Lyotard or Derrida, like all of them, they didn't see themselves as, they saw themselves as, basically it's all there. It was all there for them in Heidegger anyway. So it's like, who's modern and who's postmodern.
Right.
And if you look at some of the modern, the famous modern texts like Gargantua, Pantagruel, for example, like these are postmodern. These are postmodern texts.
Yeah, I remember. I remember in graduate school. Of course, I had to, so as an undergrad, I had basically a kind of great books program. My professors would call it a non-great books program, because we didn't limit ourselves to primary sources, but we did major secondary sources and commentaries. We read, Eliade and, a bunch of the 20th century sociology. So it wasn't like the University of Chicago great books programs. But anyway, so we read Pantagruel and all this medieval stuff. And I remember going to graduate school. And of course, when I went to graduate school in the mid-90s, of course, it was all Derrida and Lyotard and Deman and Lacan and, all that stuff, right? And because I had this deep education in the tradition, and because I had read deeply in philosophy, both ancient and post-Kantian philosophy, Heidegger especially, I remember laughing in my seminars, because my contemporaries were reading, Derrida, for instance, um, as if he was sort of saying something new, like postmodernism was like now. And I'm like, have you read any of the medievals? Right. And of course, and again, this is not because I'm awesome. This is just because I was graced with a real
Yeah.
education. I'm saying, guys, what you've effectively done, and this is like their timeline. It's like Homer, Plato, Aristotle, some Roman stuff that we don't really like to talk about. Okay, fine, we'll read Augustine. And then they'll just like skip the Kant. It's like they just
Yeah.
skipped over 1,500 years
Yeah.
of intellectual work tradition, and I found it even doubly ironic because here they are all obsessed with the logos, right, and logocentrism and all these kinds of things, and yet they ignored an entire tradition that's based upon in the beginning was the Word.
Yeah.
It was I was such a it was an exercise. I was continually frustrated because it was naivete masked as sophistication.
Yeah. But I think that it's often in the second rungs. Like Derrida was a far more sophisticated
Sure,
writer.
for sure.
He wrote a
Yeah,
text called Circumfessions,
haven't read it.
in which
Haven't read
he
it.
kind of deals with Augustine. And
Mhm.
there's,
Oh,
and
yeah, no,
anybody who
no.
was like,
He Derrida knew his stuff.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah. I'm
yeah,
talking
no,
about the
like
practitioners.
all the
Yeah,
people in the school.
yeah,
Ugh, yeah,
yeah, yeah,
but like if you want a postmodern text, dude, like Ovid's Metamorphoses
yeah.
is a
Oh,
postmodern
yeah,
text.
and
Like in
and
terms of what it's doing the same thing as a lot of the ironic,
subversion.
subversion commentary
Yeah,
upon
yeah.
commentaries that we see in the 80s, for
Right.
example. So
And Jonathan, what book is Shakespeare absolutely obsessed with? Ovid. The
yeah.
Metamorphoses. It's the one that he references over and over and over and over again. So is Shakespeare postmodern? But like, how are we sketching these
Yeah.
frames? It's
And I
a
think that that's why, like, I mean, obviously, this is why I do the things I do, which
yeah,
is that I think that if we kind of back up and we have a kind of full symbolic vision of reality, we understand that there is on the edge, a place for that kind of snake eating its tail, where things slip and things become uh move into this unformed place, or this kind of commentary and ironies and double ironies and all of this. And this is actually part of it. Like I said, it is definitely in Shakespeare. You see it, like there is this kind of self-referential aspect to some of Shakespeare's
mhm,
parts of some of Shakespeare's
mhm,
play
mhm.
that are part of the kind of postmodern thinking.
Yeah,
And so that's why I'm not anti-postmodern. Like
yeah.
what I
Me
want
neither.
is to understand the aspects of that can be reintegrated in a fuller kind of traditional way of thinking.
Right. I always used to say to my fellow travelers in graduate school, my friends who were, you know, you could never admit out loud you know, that you might be, like conservative or anything like that, right? But I love the postmoderns because they are in my way of thinking recapturing a kind of medieval sense of play,
Yeah.
and the idea of narratives and subversions and whatnot. It's just that at the end of the day, I believe in the logos and they don't. Really, that the what is it? The infinitely deferred. Oh gosh, what? The signifier, right?
Difference. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. A difference, and that I don't think that. I think that the signifier ends in the logos himself, and not in any kind of like pietistic sort of way, but like really,
Hmm.
kind of way. And so, therefore, I could read, Heidegger and all these guys with joy, even because I could tell what they were. I think that they were trying to poke back at the Enlightenment, and the sort of the sureties and the arrogances of the Enlightenment and post Enlightenment. So
Yeah.